In this panel, I'm joined by Dan Sanchez, who you've already met, Jon Hersey, who you have not met yet, who you'll be hearing from later today, who's a fellow at OSI, the Objective Standard Institute, Angel, who you heard from earlier, and Thomas Walker-Werth, who you also have not yet met, but who you will be meeting later today, also a fellow at the Objective Standard Institute. We're going to be talking about what rights are actually wrongs. Some of the things that are seeming rights or that are argued to be rights that are in fact not rights. Some of these things most people on the stage are going to agree on, some they might not, so you'll hear perhaps a little bit of friendly debate. But we're going to discuss first some of these questions of things that are often claimed to be rights or debated as rights that perhaps are not. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A for all of you. So you will also have a chance, if you are not satisfied by an explanation given up on the stage, you are welcome to ask a question and push back. If we move past something too quickly and you want us to expand, you're welcome to ask about that. Or if there's something that's often called a human right that you are curious about in the context of how we're defining a right, you are also welcome to ask us about that. But we're going to begin with some of the common ideas of rights. We're going to talk about things like 3 square meals a day and healthcare. I want to start with my personal favorite because I can. I want to talk about education as a right to open this up. Is education a right? Does anybody want to take a first stab at this?
Sure. I would say that you have the right to pursue an education, to go out there and find someone who's willing to provide you with one or provide your child with one. And if you're an educator, then you have a right to go out there and find people to educate. So people have the right, as part of their right to go about life and pursue their values, the right to trade with each other, to educate themselves and to educate others. You don't have the right to have somebody come and educate you. And in fact, I think the idea that we have that right, that we're entitled to a government education or somehow entitled to 15 years of school, actually violates our right to be educated in other ways. Or you know, if you have a public school system, which most countries do, then it's harder for you. Sometimes it's illegal for you to find other types of schools, find other solutions for education. It actually restricts your access to education as much as providing it.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it is the age-old question of who owns the means of production? And that includes the means of production of your own education. And so then you think about like, okay, what are the means of production of your education? There's your brain, for one thing. Your brain is actually a physical thing that is part of your body, and we each own our brains. Like, it just doesn't make sense for anyone else to own anyone else's brain. That would just, how would that even function? So, and you own your eyes, and maybe you own a book. And so if you own that book and you own your eyes and you own your brain, then you have the right to the education that can happen in that substrate, in that medium. But if it's someone else's book, you don't have the right to force that person to transfer that book to you. Or if you are expecting someone to buy a book or produce a book for you, or to produce a school system for you. And so then that connects with taxes. Like does the, someone on the other side of the country who I have no relation to, they have a job and they have money, and do I have a right to get the government to take the money that they earn from their job in order to finance a public school for my daughter? I don't think I do. That doesn't mean that I don't want an education for my daughter, and it doesn't mean I don't want an education for everyone. I just think that if things are provided voluntarily, that they are provided more abundantly and more naturally.
Yeah, just to add on to Dan's point there, I like to think about what does an education require? It requires teachers, administrators, buildings, materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You guys all go to school or have been to school. You can make the list yourselves. If you're saying you have a right to an education, it means you have a right to all of those things. Most importantly, the time of the people who make it happen, the teachers, the administrators, these people, if you have a right to an education, you have a right to those people's time, which is in fact a violation of their rights. And the other thing, like you were saying, Dan, you want an education for your daughter. Usually when people are arguing that people have a right to education, the argument is basically education is good for people. It helps them to lift themselves out of poverty. It helps them to achieve all these wonderful things. And that's true. It's true that education is good for you. Good education is good for you. But just because something is good for you, it doesn't mean that you have a right to it. Physical fitness is good for you. That doesn't mean you have a right to a gym.
The basic question I think that underlies all of these answers is just at whose expense? Who is going to be forced to pay for and supply the good or service involved in this education? And I think when you just think about it in terms of concretes and people, and you think about the people in your own community, is there somebody that you would feel comfortable forcing to do anything, be it education or something else? And is it really a good scenario if somebody who's supposed to be giving you intellectual content and helping you in your life, if that person is in some way forced, or somebody else is forced to pay them on your behalf? And I think Hannah's work shows that there's a whole realm of people out there that are really good at educating, and that they can do it much, much better if they aren't forced to do it under certain circumstances and with certain budgets that are taken from other people just voluntarily, because they're really good at it, they love what they do, and others see that value and they're willing to pay for it.
And I think Hannah is a great example of how when things are voluntary, it makes people not only better producers, but better consumers. Because like with Hannah's experience, that like she was telling us about how these parents are just reaching out to her, like wanting the best education for their kids, and they're really invested in it. And it's not just babysitting for them. Like they want them to be truly learning. And when it's not voluntary, the customers aren't as good of customers. Like when you are, for one thing, they don't have much say over the system, because if you, just like, how you feel when you're at the DMV, you don't really feel like a customer. Like you feel like you're the servant and you need to appease the DMV person. And in a bureaucracy like with a school system, that's the way parents often feel. Whereas with someone like Hannah, Hannah is their servant. Hannah is an entrepreneur, and she wants to earn their business, and they know that she's that way, and so the customer is always right, and so they become more engaged. And I think we see that with parents and the public school system at the elementary and high school level, but we also see it at the college level, because because college students aren't the best customers right now either, largely because student aid for college is so subsidized. And so they're not incentivized to be like really demanding customers to make sure they're getting the most value out of it. For a lot of people, it's just maybe like postponement of adulthood or the party aspects of it. And partially because, especially when they have the prospect of borrowing a lot of money and having that money forgiven by being financed by taxpayer bailouts, again, they just aren't very good consumers. But when they have their own skin in the game and their own money on the line and their own, then they're more invested, and then they get better education out of it.
Well, so you could say that they're not very good consumers, and I think that's true for a lot of them. But there are also a lot of parents that do want more from the public schools, and they go and they ask for it, and they don't get it. And I don't know if you guys recall, but a year or two ago, you had state departments of education reporting to federal bureaus and likening parents to terrorists because the parents were going to school board meetings and simply requesting that their children's education not include things on gender identity for kids that are very young and shouldn't be concerned about this stuff at that point. And for simply requesting that their children get an appropriate and rational education for their grade level. And if you're in a forced system where your money is taken from you and it's given to people who are insulated, they have no market competition, you no longer have that choice, and it leads to this pandemonium where people are, they're upset about the fact that they can't simply opt out and go to another school district or find another producer of the good that they're trying to buy.
Let's pivot this a little bit, because another thing that is often touted as a right is healthcare. And it's so easy to say, well, surely everybody has a right to take care of their bodies and their health. What's the response to that?
So I've come here from the United Kingdom, which has a little thing called the NHS. In the UK, we have a public healthcare system where the government provides free at the point of delivery healthcare to everyone. And it's still legal in the UK to get private healthcare, but the effect of having that public system or that government-run healthcare system is that there's absolutely no market, no economic opportunity for cheap private healthcare. The market is completely dominated, completely swamped by the huge bureaucracy of the NHS. The NHS consumes billions and billions of dollars every year. It's enormously expensive to operate. And the consequence of this idea that everyone has a right to healthcare is that you have months or years-long waiting lists for major treatments. You have doctors who are incentivized to push patients away. My father had cancer when I was 12, and several times he went with a lump in his throat, and they said, oh, it's probably just a cyst, don't worry about it. And in a private healthcare system, you're far more likely to get the opposite. You're far more likely to get them saying, let's just get you seen anyway and make sure. So the system in America is broken in various ways as well. There's a lot of government regulation and crony sort of involved businesses using the government to get ahead in the US system too. But a system based on the principle that you have a right to healthcare like we have in the UK is not something you want. It doesn't get you better healthcare. We have good healthcare because we have technology from the US and other countries. Much even worse in Canada, where you can't even get private healthcare. It's illegal to. And that system violates your right as a patient to get the best healthcare and the treatment that you want. And it violates the rights of doctors, the same as in education that with teachers, that they can't go and provide you the service they want to provide you. And if you have a complaint, they can't do anything about it. They can't change the service that they offer you like a private provider could.
It also leaves the entire country at the mercy of strikes. We've had a lot of strikes in the UK in the past couple of years because the doctors know that if they walk out, there's almost no healthcare left, which leaves a lot of people in very dire straits and means that a lot of people, like, if you're not in healthcare, you shouldn't care what the doctor is getting paid. That's not your business. Generally speaking, it's not your business what other people are getting paid. But when you're in the UK, now people who have never worked in healthcare in their lives have an opinion about whether the doctors are making enough money because their healthcare depends on it. It makes everyone be more involved in other people's business. But again, I want to bring it back to the principle of what does healthcare require? It requires highly trained professionals, doctors, nurses, technicians, so on. It requires a ton of technology. It requires buildings. If you're saying people have a right to that, you're saying somebody has to provide those things. Somebody has to go to medical school for 10 years to then take care of you, whether you can pay them or not. Does that seem fair?
And do you really want your doctors to be the equivalent of the people working at the DMV? Do you want them to essentially be handcuffed? The people that are going to cut you open, do you want them to be servants enslaved to a state system, even if they're not individually forced to work for free. Somebody is being, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, in effect, and it doesn't make it any more moral. And if you think about a doctor's life under a government healthcare system in which every aspect of what they do is dictated by some regulation, what would your life be if your career, if everything you did, you had to while away your days filing this incredibly inane paperwork and didn't actually get to focus on your passion, your true calling in life, which is medicine and helping people, which is an incredible thing. It's a great thing to be passionate about. And that is sucked from your life and from your career if you work under this sort of control. It's terrible both for the patients and for the doctors.
For the international audience, real quick, I just want to say the DMV is the Department of Motor Vehicles. We can replace it with any bureaucracy you've ever dealt with in your life, and it will be exactly the same, I promise.
I'd like to provoke a friendly debate, if there's possible friendly debate around this. Do you guys think that patent rights are true rights, in particularly pharmaceutical patents?
Well, I definitely think that we have a right to our lives, including a right to our time and the things that we create with our time and with our labor. So yeah, I do think that there are such things as intellectual property rights that recognize the property that you have created, even though it's not a physical thing, whether it's the recipe for Coca-Cola or the recipe for a new antibiotic. And if you don't have that right, I think it's an interesting thought example, if not a perfect knockdown argument against this. But think about, like, for instance, the companies that created COVID-19 vaccines over the course of a weekend. Why would they do that if the next company can come in and literally just copy exactly what they did, reverse engineer it, and start selling it for pennies cheaper? There would be no incentive. So I know this is a sort of consequentialist argument, but I think the rights-based argument in this is that, the creations of your own mind are your property, and you ought to have some exclusivity to that. And of course, we can debate as to the period for how long and under what conditions and what constitutes a violation of that right and what doesn't. But I think the principle is, yes, there is certainly a right to your intellectual property.
So I'm curious what other people think about this too, but I'll just present sort of my counter perspective on that. Is that, again, like I was talking about in my lecture, like I really think of the function of rights is to deal with the reality of scarcity. And so we have we have to have allocated rights over our bodies and possessions, because as scarce resources, if they're used for one thing, they cannot be used for another. But the thing about when you're talking about like the fruits of your labor, like when you create something like a new drug, the pill itself, for example, there's the scarce material aspect of the pill. That is definitely needs to be allocated according to property rights, because if I take the pill, you can't take the pill. The formula of creating the pill, that is not scarce. It may take resources in order to develop the formula, but the formula itself, like, no matter how many pills I make according to a certain formula, for myself, that doesn't preclude someone else from being able to get the exact same benefit of that. And so in my perspective, the form, like the informational aspect of a resource, that doesn't make sense to be allocated as a right.
But Dan, how do you respond to Jon's argument that if you don't have rights over the things that you create, then you don't have an incentive to create them?
Could I just say one thing before you answer that? I think I would just challenge you to think about the scarcity of intellectual achievement. Our brains, our minds are these fantastic, amazing things. And we can only create what we create under very specific conditions. And the people that do that work, I think, have a right to what they've created. And so there is a scarcity there. It's not a physical scarcity.
Yeah, so the way I think of it is that the incentive is what's called first mover advantage. So when someone innovates something, and that can be a scientific innovation, it can be a cultural innovation, then they are able, they're the first ones out with it, and they generally get, like if it's a business thing, they get profit from it because they're on the scene first. And then emulation happens. But that is not a bug of the market. That's a feature of the market. Emulation is supposed to happen. Entrepreneurs are not supposed to have permanent locks on profits. That's exactly what patents are. As long as the patents are continuing, it's a lock. It's a literal monopoly on profits. But the way that markets naturally work and normally work is that entrepreneurs have the first mover advantage, and then emulators follow along, and the resources of the economy follow the leader, and then the profits get whittled down, and the first mover advantage expires at some point. But that's good for society because that means that it then becomes cheap and abundant for everyone. So for example, something like an iPhone, like at first that's like a luxury item, but eventually, competitors start to be able to emulate. Competition whittles down the profit margins, and then it's not a luxury item; it becomes a mass item. And so I think that is the way that markets normally work, and the opposite of that is called monopoly. And that ultimately is what intellectual property is, that it's not actually property, that it's monopoly.
So I'd like to, although I agree with a lot of what Dan just said about how markets operate, I'd like to disagree with the origin of property rights. I don't think they come from scarcity. I think there's an implication there that if we have abundance, property rights disappear, like in a Star Trek future where we can replicate anything, there'll suddenly be no property rights. I don't think that's true. I think property rights come from your right to your life. And to just use a really simple example, if somebody like J.K. Rowling or Lewis, whoever wrote The Giver, to use an example, we've got Lois Lowry, that's right, spends hours, months, years of their lives writing a book. There's a piece of intellectual property there. The book itself is the intellectual property. And that embodies, like the author's right to that work embodies the author's right to all that time and energy that he or she spent creating that work. And if Rowling publishes Harry Potter and then immediately anyone can just publish their own copy of Harry Potter and sell it, she can't trade her effort for money to buy things. And that's how human beings sustain their lives. If you think back to just sort of an early civilization period when you needed to till the land for food or you needed to build your own housing. If you build a house by yourself in the middle of the desert or wherever, and you need to live in it, that's your right to that property because that's how you're sustaining your life. That's what human beings do. We use our minds to build things, create things to sustain our lives. In a modern context, that's often intellectual rather than physical. We create things that then I write books and articles, I trade them with other people, I get money for them. Now, an important distinction I think you're getting close to, Dan, is that you own the thing you've created. You don't own the facts of reality that you discover or explain in that work. So if you write a nonfiction work, say you write a book about astronomy, on the planet Neptune or something, you do some research on what's going on in Neptune's clouds, you publish a book on it. People shouldn't be able to then publish that same book and take the money for it, but they should totally be able to publish other books about those same facts. So the reason that Samsung can come out and make a thing similar to the iPhone is because all the principles that go into how the iPhone works are not part of the intellectual property. It's the design of the actual iPhone itself that's the intellectual property.
Score 1 for you. All right, I'll take it.
We have some audience support for that view.
So one thing that example reminds me of is that a lot of times people talk about the innovation benefits of intellectual property, but neglect the innovation costs of intellectual property. And I think that's even the case for things like literature, because when you think about how literature evolved before the rise of intellectual property, before the rise of copyright, is that everything was a remix. So when you think about things like Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey and the development of mythology and great literature, like that was yesteryear's version of Harry Potter. And there was no copyright. It was like an oral tradition, and people were constantly reformulating and building on, and that's how these masterpieces formed. It wasn't just one isolated genius. Like, it was like a cultural natural selection of the best parts of every version of a story got selected for and got refined over time, and that's how we got these timeless classics. And I think that is the case with patents also. Like, a lot of people that we think of as these great innovators, like they were actually the people who stopped the innovation, because they're the ones that got the credit, because they're the ones that filed for the patent, and that's where innovation actually stopped. Because even though they had built off of the tinkering of the previous things, that they didn't allow people to tinker off of them to continue to innovate. So when we think about like medicines, like amazing medicines, we can't just think about like, okay, the incentives of like, okay, I get a lock on this, and like that's why I'm investing all this time. We also have to think about like, okay, what about all the people that could build off of that and make something even better, and they're not allowed to anymore?
I want to push back on a lot of that. With all due respect to Dan, of course. So firstly, I would say it's true that what we have left of the ancients is mostly an amalgamation of earlier's works. In terms of literature, that's not true in terms of fiction. We have, or in terms of nonfiction, excuse me, we have Aristotle, we have Plato, we have individual thinkers' rights, and I think those are also timeless classics. But I also want to point out that capitalism has set artists free from needing to depend on the patronage of one powerful individual or a couple of powerful individuals. It used to be that if you wanted to be an artist, you needed to find a place in a court, or you couldn't do it for a living. Now, you post it online. You find somebody there are tons of opportunities that you have to make money being an artist of any kind, visual art, musical art, etc., just from your bedroom even. So I think that's really set a lot of people free in terms of innovation for art. Also, just because J.K. Rowling has a copyright on Harry Potter doesn't mean people can't take those characters and do something fun with them. They absolutely do. Fan fiction is a thriving industry, and people are even turning it 50 Shades of Grey. I know, sorry. But that started out as Twilight fan fiction, and now it's a multi-million-dollar movie franchise that I refuse to watch on principle. So I don't think it's true that just because somebody files a patent that stops innovation. And I think that trying to think about it that way really falls into the zero-sum fallacy of people are able to make their own alternatives even if you've already filed a patent on yours, and maybe that alternative will be even better than what you came up with. And also, just as a final point, I know you want to speak, I would think we can look at countries that have protected intellectual property rights versus countries that haven't, and who is innovating more than whom. For the modern example, you could look at Russia, at China. They're not innovating, they're stealing. And that's been that way for a long time.
The funny thing is that China is now stealing the American patent system to do more innovation, but that's another matter. I just want to bring a couple of concretes into play and make one distinction quickly. So in terms of fiction, what you're describing, Dan, in the ancient world, I think still happens. Star Wars came out in 1977. That was a fusion of Dune, of Flash Gordon, of various other influences that came before it. And then you had Battle Beyond the Stars, you had Battlestar Galactica, you had the Star Trek movies, which, again, Star Trek influenced Star Wars. This thing goes on. We still get that cascade. You get Hunger Games, you get Maze Runner, you get all these. That inspiration still happens. And similarly in technology, like James Watt developed the steam engine, Richard Trevithick perfected it, Robert Stevenson perfected it, all these different people, because they could patent the specific designs, but they couldn't patent the idea that you heat steam to drive a piston. And the distinction I think that still happens. The distinction I want to make is that we're talking in principles. The specific way that that's implemented in law is a somewhat separate discussion. There's philosophy, and then there's philosophy of law, like how you tie that down. And specifically how much of a design you can patent, the specifics of that are a much more complicated discussion, and it's entirely possible, I think probably the case in many countries, that some patents maybe cover elements of the principle underlying the invention that maybe shouldn't be included and do restrict innovation.
So I think you're right that it is happening, but I would really argue that it's not happening enough, because what I really see in Hollywood and television especially is just cultural vandalism. Like the IP owners of things like Superman and the Marvel Comics characters and the Star Wars characters. I mean, to each their own. You guys might love them. That's fine. But like, I think that the current IP owners don't understand these characters, and that as a result, they're able to hold them hostage. That it doesn't matter how much failure that they have, like they're able to do whatever they want with them, and they're able to sue into oblivion anyone who wants to make a real Superman story, who actually understands like the nature of Superman, and that's just a loss, because you could make like a Superman-ish character, but it's never going to be as good as Superman himself, like with someone who actually understands that. But again, it's just locked down in a monopoly.
So what we're talking about is kind of dancing around the entire theme of this talk, which is what rights are wrongs. I'd like to define what a wrong is and why that's what this whole debate is about. Who wants to take a first stab at this? What is a wrong?
A wrong is to use force against another person, to force somebody to hand over something that they own or to do something that they don't want to do. And if I could, I would also offer that a right is just a recognition. It's a principle that recognizes that as a human being, by your nature, you have to act in a certain way to sustain your life and to achieve a good life. And a right recognizes that principle and puts it on public display and says, look, nobody else can violate that principle by using force against you.
One of the things that is also underlying the debates that we're having up here, I said not everybody was going to agree with each other. The underpinning of all of this is an understanding of not just what a right is, but where it comes from, like how you determine a right. And I'd like to get into that a little bit too. We've debated a lot of different rights. How do we think about what is and is not a right based on where it comes from? Like, what is the underlying first principles logic that we use to, when we look at something, someone's like, well, is broadband internet a right? You have a formula in your head to kind of think about this because you have an understanding of what makes something a right. I'd like to hear from maybe all of you, but definitely a couple of you, how you think about where a right comes from, and therefore how to discern when you're presented with something new, whether or not it would be a right.
I'll just expand on what I just said. I think there's essentially one right, a right to life. And what that means is that you have the right to action. You have the right to take the actions required for the being and living as the type of being that you are as a human being. And the types of beings that we are beings that have to act on our reason, on our rational faculty. We have to use our reason to create the goods and services that enable us to meet the requirements of survival and to thrive. And so a right, in my view, is simply, it's sort of equivalent to a law of physics. The laws of physics aren't out there in the sense that anyone can just see them, right? You don't look at that door and see the laws of physics. The laws of physics are things that we can discover by observing lots of different facts about reality and then coming to a conclusion about how things work. And individual rights are precisely the same thing, but they relate to us. And the way that we work is to live by using our minds to create the values on which our lives depend to survive and thrive.
So it's really interesting that a lot of people who agree largely about the conclusions about rights disagree about the philosophical underpinnings. And so for example, like what you just heard Jon describing, that is straight from Ayn Rand, but it's also straight from John Locke. That Ayn Rand and John Locke had similar philosophies, and it really involved that sort of chain of reasoning that there's at bottom the right to life, and then if you have a right to life, you have a right to sustain your life, like you have a right to livelihood. And in order to sustain your life, you need external resources. And so, in order to have that right to life, you need to be able to have a right to external possessions. However, there are different philosophies. So for example, another Enlightenment philosopher, David Hume, when he talked about rights in his philosophical work, it was very different from the way that Locke described it. And with Hume, it really did center more on scarcity. It was that, like, our life, like what is the substrate of our life is our body, and our body is scarce, and we can only do some things and not other things, and also these other resources that we want to use, that those are scarce, and so, like, how do we best allocate that? And so, like, and then there are different libertarian thinkers today that are kind of like more influenced by Hume than by Locke, and so so that's a little bit in the weeds, but I think there actually are implications for some of these finer points, like about intellectual property, that stem from those philosophical differences.
Okay, I want to open this up now for questions because I knew a lot of hands were going to go up. Abby's going to come around with a microphone, and we have a little bit of time, so hopefully we'll have a chance to get to a few of these. We have one in the front. Abby, can we do this one first?
Thank you so much for the debate. And I have a question for the last part of it. And when you ask about where does the right come from, or how do you terminate it, what do you believe about the thing in the Romanian countries, like when the law, it has to be positivized, like all has to be written? At what time my liberty has to be determined by a law in order to be respect to others? Like, in what moment can other respect my liberty to do something? Is it if it's not written in law, and knowing that the government understands only that I have the right to do something only if it's written? If, for example, in Bolivia, and it's a funny example though, we have like this agenda that says all the Bolivians have the right to be happy. And it's like, I know that I have the right to be happy. I know that I have to achieve it myself. But if it's not written, like, I would not have the opportunity or to liberty to be happy.
Great question. Who wants to take this?
I'll start. I think the important thing is whether or not the way they're using the concept of right make sense according to reality, according to the way that things actually are and that people actually are. So Ayn Rand's approach to the concept of rights is to ask, do we even need the word? Do we even need the concept, and why? And in her view, the reason we need it is because human beings are the kind of beings that we are. We are rational beings that use our minds to survive. So if you can't define the right in terms of recognizing how human beings survive, how we sustain our lives, then it doesn't stand up against reality. And also, if it logically contradicts, like a right to be happy is meaningless. Like, what if my happiness means I need to be king of the world and enslave everyone? Like, clearly I don't have a right to that. It would contradict everyone else's rights. So yes, you do need a constitution or a body of law to tell the government what it can and can't do. But I think ultimately your standard of determining whether or not something's a right isn't the law. It's the facts of reality. It's how human beings actually live and how we actually sustain our lives.
Yeah, I think the proper purpose of a document like a constitution is to set the framework for restricting the use of force. And the government has a monopoly on force. So primarily you need to be concerned with restricting the government. And this is what the American Constitution does, is the government cannot make laws except about these things. By contrast, when you are making laws that only allow citizens to do certain things, that's what some people will call a permission society. It's rampant in Europe, where, for example, in the European Union, food additives are not allowed unless they have been specifically cleared. So it's not legal until it's legal, rather than it's legal until it's outlawed. And that's an important distinction. When you have a permission society, you're treating everyone like children. You know, you're not allowed to do it unless mom or dad says you can, right? So I think that's an important distinction, that when you have a permission society, you're treating rights as things that come from the government. And the problem is, if the government gives them, the government can take them away. That makes them privileges and not rights.
I don't want to get, I mean, if you have something that you really want to add, you can, but I think we have a lot of questions.
I'll just say quickly, this goes to the purpose of government, which Dan will be talking about. And if you think that the purpose of government is to protect our rights and that it serves the people and not the other way around, then I think that really helps you understand what the government can and can't grant, and what it ought to be saying and what it ought not to be pronouncing on.
Okay, I think Abby has somebody picked out for the next question.
Hi, my name is Jade Christensen. I'm from Puerto Rico. Nice to meet you all. I kind of wanted to bring back the topic of education, more specifically higher education. So in Puerto Rico, obviously a lot of us, at least at my University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras, we rely on the federal Pell Grant from the FAFSA to go to university. And so a lot of times, well, I'm pretty sure in all situations where you're guaranteed this federal Pell Grant, there is a lot of money that is residue. And so it's a very controversial topic on the island, and obviously in other places too. What is done with this residual money? And I kind of wanted to tie this into what ensures less individual freedom, the concept of free college and free higher education, and depending on the government to go to college, and by using student loan debt, obviously. So thank you so much.
Well, I think that by the government's very involvement in the entire institution of higher education, the price of everything goes up in part because of the residue, and the quality goes down necessarily. So your question is, what should we do about this?
Pretty much is what ensures less individual freedom, and what is your opinion or take on the federal Pell Grant situation?
What ensures less individual freedom, and what is our take on the Pell Grant situation? We're less free if the government is involved in any aspect of higher education. There's no reason for them to be, and my take is that we ought to get them out.
Yeah, there are a bunch of old sayings that kind of this example makes me think of. There's, it's hard to bite the hand that feeds you. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And any government that is big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything away. And so a lot of times when people think of these things as rights, that it's actually depriving yourself of rights because it's putting all the power in the provider, in the government. Because if it's the government that is the paymaster, that is the one that's distributing education through the distribution of Pell Grants, they get to decide what constitutes education. And they get to decide who gets an education. And so what is meant to feel empowering is actually disempowering.
Can I just add a little bit about how government has made higher education more expensive, particularly in the US? It's by subsidizing so much education, colleges know they can charge more because they know you have at least the Pell Grant. They know you have at least this much money. So that jacks up the price of everything. Plus, you have to add financial aid offices and layers of bureaucracy and administrators. So that makes everything more expensive. And you can track it. There are graphs that show from when certain government programs were introduced and the price of college just skyrocketing right up there. So I think the Pell Grant is supposed to help solve the problem, but really it's making it worse.
Not to mention the fact that the government is controlling how much money there is and printing money to pay for all this stuff, which is then making the money less valuable, which makes everything more expensive as well. So your education's like 50, 100 times more expensive than it needs to be at the end of the day when you factor all of that in.
Can we get another show of hands who has questions? We have some over here. Abby.
Okay, I'm going to start here.
Oh, amazing.
Okay. Hello. Okay.
Hi.
So this is kind of a meta question. Do you guys think that human rights or rights in general apply to animals? And if you don't, when in the biological history of humanity do rights begin? Precisely.
We got some heavy hitters.
I'll start on this. My wife and I are actually both vegetarians because we love animals. We don't like the idea of killing and eating animals ourselves, but we don't think animals have rights either. It's a bit of a nuanced position maybe, but rights, as I sort of said earlier, come from the fact that we need to use reason to survive and that we have concepts. Those things don't apply to animals. So you like a lion can't respect your rights. Like he doesn't have the concept. So it literally doesn't apply in the context of animals. That doesn't mean it's morally fine to just abuse and be horrible to animals. I think there's a big difference between rights, which is a concept which deal with how human beings or conceptual animals, if there are other conceptual animals, we don't know of any, but if we meet aliens or we find intelligent animals, we discover that dolphins have concepts or something, that would change the picture. But at the moment, rights are how we determine the principle we use to determine how rational beings should interact with each other and form the basis of a legal system to control how we use force against each other or don't. That doesn't apply to animals, but that doesn't mean that just because it shouldn't be illegal to murder a cat or something, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. If you're somebody who enjoys going around abusing animals, that probably means you've got psychological issues and weird priorities, and you should be shunned by your friends and family, and there's all sorts of reasons why that's gross and wrong. So I would separate the principle of rights from how it's moral to behave more broadly, which is a much wider sphere.
And I've been talking about how rights, the function of rights has to do with scarcity. And more specifically, it has to do with, in the reality of scarcity, facilitating social cooperation. That's the way Ludwig von Mises, a great economist who used to work for FEE, characterized the source of rights, the source of society. And so there's this law called the law of comparative advantage in economics. And Mises thought that this was such a profound, important law that he called it the law of association, that this economic principle is why we come together as a society. And because of this law, it's true that when actors divide labor and cooperate in collaboration, that they all benefit from that cooperation because of the efficiencies of that cooperation. And And so the function of rights is to facilitate that. But the thing is that with animals, that they are not capable of they don't have the moral makeup of their minds to be able to recognize, to reciprocally recognize our rights. And so we can't really cooperate with them in that same way. We can't divide our labor with them in that same way. And so as a result, so Adam Smith talked in The Wealth of Nations. He talked about how you've never seen like a dog trade a bone with another dog. That they just don't do that. And there's some really interesting anthropology. There's a book called The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley, and he talks about how in the archaeological record there's a part where trade starts to occur, and that is like a really big threshold in what transitioned us from animals to humanity. Because once we were able to trade, and once we had the moral makeup to be able to divide labor, then we were able to come up with these principles like rights, and then able to create like the collective intelligence of an actual society. And so those are some leads.
Fantastic question. Fantastic answer. That was awesome. I think we have some questions in the back.
This is going to be our last question for this session. Okay.
You can come find us at lunch and debate all of this. Go ahead.
Okay, so in relation to this, I do find a hole in the argument that rights relate to reason. Because what happens with humans that have some sort of impediment to carry what their own reasonings dictate? Do we become reasonable until we are 16, 18, 21? Do newborns have rights? Do people with these deficiencies mentally or psychologically have rights? Because at the end of the day, they don't take the actions and that they want to? Because, yeah, basically.
Great question.
Yeah, I can start on this one. The individuals that you're talking about, individuals who are severely impaired, by the way, I don't think a mild mental illness means you can't be rational, but severely impaired individuals, very young individuals, do not have the ability to exercise their rights. Rights are freedom of action. A baby can only do so much. So what we do with those individuals, generally, when you're a child, they're entrusted to the care of the parents. Jon is a new parent. His son Leo's rights are in his care, his and his wife's. And that's until Leo is able to exercise them on his own. And it's a gradual process. He's learning. Jon made us all choke up the other day with his Facebook post for his son's first birthday about how many things he's learning, how many things he's starting to be able to do in his first year. And he's going to continue doing that for a long time. So as he becomes more able, it's kind of a gradual process of dealing with those rights. With individuals who are permanently disabled, it's a more complicated and more touchy subject. But personally, I think if they are not able to deal with their rights on their own, then it still needs to be entrusted to someone else. And they don't have the ability to participate fully simply because they don't have that capacity within themselves. It's not a moral judgment. It's just how they are.
Yeah, I would add to that when Rand and others like Aristotle talk about man or humanity, people as rational animals, that doesn't mean we're all mathematicians, scientists. Like, reason is the human ability to build an understanding of the world, a consistent, logical understanding of the world, and understand concepts. And if you can speak a language, you've got reason. Everyone in this room has reason. There are very, very, very few people who don't have reason, and even you'd have to have an extreme level of mental damage to not have reason at all. And in terms of children, the youngest babies are starting to develop that almost immediately. They're starting to figure out their environment and how to interact with it, and grouping things they see into concepts before they're speaking. So a baby is a potential life form. The adult that he's going to grow into has rights, and if you abuse a child, then you're violating the adults that he's going to be. You're going to mess up that whole life all the way down. So I think you could only essentially lose your right to life if you literally had a completely non-functional brain and were essentially dead at that point. And I think sustaining life at that point is a futile exercise anyway, unless if there's a realistic prospect of recovery of even with future advancement, then you should try for that. But if somebody's just living in a completely vegetative state, then I don't think you're doing anything kind to that person by sustaining their life at that stage anyway. And I don't think the concept of rights applies at that point.
The baby or the toddler has rights. Those rights are held in trust by the caregiver, and it's the same exact situation if your loved one becomes catatonic, is in a coma. And it's both a matter of observable fact, but it's also just the way the world works. I'm responsible for my child, and if your loved one goes into a coma, you're going to be responsible for making medical decisions for that person.
Okay, I saw a lot more hands that we didn't have time to get to. So if you have additional questions, you can come find some or all of us during lunch, which is what we're about to do, finally. We're going to take an hour for lunch. The same buffet table where you got breakfast is going to have lunch set up. You can bring your plates back in here to eat and to chat with each other. We're going to come back here if you guys can wait just a moment, I have a couple important announcements before you go. We're going to come back here at 1:30. Please be back here promptly and ready to go so that we have just as packed of an afternoon as we've had of a morning. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get settled in and get started. When you return from lunch, even if you haven't left this space, please check in at the registration desk. We're going to do attendance again for the afternoon. So please check in with the the registration desk before you find your seat. All right, go have a great lunch, and I will see you guys in an hour.